This morning we're going to have the Marxist theory of imperialism. What is it? A Marxist critique. And our speaker today is Judy Cox. Judy is a primary school teacher in a certain area, and she's also just edited this book along with Colin Bryce, and We Fought the Law, a collection of stories about fighting police and police violence in Britain. So Judy's going to speak for about 30 minutes. Then we'll have a short period where, for 3 minutes, where you speak to people next to you, and then we'll have some discussion before bringing Judy back in. So take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I'm assuming that everybody here is very hardy and dedicated to developing their politics to be here at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning for the Marxist theory of imperialism, so you're very welcome. One of the interesting things, I just want to make a couple of general comments about our theory of imperialism before getting into the heart of it. And one of the interesting things is when you go back and look and read a bit about the history of the theory of imperialism, you are struck time and time again by how our tradition has been vindicated, by the power of our tradition, because time and time again, opponents on the right and some who consider themselves to be on the left have declared that imperialism is dead, that imperialism is no more, that the system's developed in such a way that we no longer need to concern ourselves with questions of imperialism. And time again, those theories have crashed into new erupting imperialist wars. So that's the first thing to say. Our tradition on the theory of imperialism is enduring and has been vindicated through the decades. And the second thing to say is that our tradition is built on the analysis developed by Marx and Engels, but it is also being constructed by generations of talented, insightful and dedicated revolutionary socialists since then. So although Marx and Engels laid the foundation for the theory of imperialism, it was Lenin, it was Luxemburg, it was Nikolai Bukharin, and even in our own times, thinking about people like Chris Harman and Alex Kalinikos, who have taken the bones of the theory, kept the principles in place, but adapted that theory for a changing world. The third thing I want to say is that the theory of imperialism is a vital part of our intellectual armoury. For anybody who wants to change the world we're living in and to understand the world we're living in, the theory of imperialism is absolutely vital. It is not, however, a convenient tick list for us to go, here are 5 features. Do these apply to this country? They are an imperialist. They don't apply to this country. They are a sub-imperialist. Perhaps they are a national liberation struggle. It is not a tick list, which is a substitute for looking empirically at every situation, what the balance of forces are, what the politics of each country is. What it is a theory that prevents us from being pulled behind imperialist powers. It anchors us in the question of the self-emancipation of the working class. It stops us being pulled behind those people who say, this is a different kind of war. This isn't an imperialist war like the past. This war is for liberation. This war is for democracy. This war is to save the people. It stops us being pulled behind those people, mentioning no names, Paul Mason and people like that. So there is a long and hideous history of rich, powerful countries exterminating and enslaving indigenous populations, stealing their wealth, shipping grain out in front of starving people, and these have left lasting legacies in our world. This is the map of the British Empire in 1914, the empire on which the sun never set, and in the words of the great Chartist and socialist Ernest Jones, and on which blood never dried. A vicious, brutal empire, and it is the image that many of us think of when we think of colonialism and so on. But the imperialism I want to talk about today is not that general description of inequality, of looting, of exterminating indigenous populations. It is something that is specific to the last 150 years, and it has 2 components. Firstly, it is rooted in economic competition between major capitals, between major companies who are driven to pursue profits. Secondly, it is also rooted in geopolitical competition between nation states. Those 2 things are not exactly the same. They are very closely related, but they are not exactly the same. I don't think Bill Gates phoned Donald Trump and said, can we please have a bombing campaign in? That relationship doesn't exist. States do not simply act as instruments of major capital, and major capitals do not simply expect the state to do their bidding. However, at the end of the day, of course, there is a very, very close relationship between the two. And it also means that war in our society is not an aberration. It is not true that most of the planet, most of the time, is living a peaceful, comfortable life, and occasionally a war might come along and blow that comfort and security out of the water. We live in a world where we are constantly preparing for war, where huge amounts of our assets are spent on military development, military technology, and weapons that, of course, if they were ever used, would blow the world up 400 times. So war, preparations for war and permanent wars are features of the capitalist system that we live in. They are not aberrations, sadly, they are the norm. But so is resistance to imperialism. Just as Marx said, capitalism creates its own gravedigger, so international expansion, so capitalist imperialism also creates its own gravedigger on an international level. So you can see that movements against imperialism in the margins of the world, like in Vietnam, can have a huge impact in the centre of world capitalism, as it did in Vietnam. The heroic resistance of the Viet Cong and so on to the American invasions of Vietnam led to a huge political explosion inside America itself. So capitalism breeds its gravedigger, imperialism breeds international resistance. So, coming on to the bare bones of the theory, that's just the intro. Our theory is rooted in Marx's analysis. So, the context when Marx was writing in the sort of 1840s, 50s and 60s was the death of millions of people in India, the death of the Irish in the potato famine, millions of people dead and driven out, the Chinese opium wars, African people starving, and the great scramble for Africa beginning. People dying not because there was no grain, but because grain was shipped out to those who could afford to pay for it, to where prices were higher. So Marx didn't develop a detailed theory of imperialism, but he understood, and central to Marx's analysis was the idea that competition constantly drives our system forward. So in the Communist Manifesto, he said the need of a constantly expanding market chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, and establish connections everywhere. They cannot, even if they wanted to, just remain in one country. They have to chase international production and fight for markets, for profits, and for raw materials. And so what Marx did establish was the key ideas which later developed into the theory of imperialism, that capitalism is a dynamic system, that capitalism is built on eternal competition, innovation. It is never stable, it is never peaceful, it is always driving forward, and at its heart is exploitation, the exploitation of the working class wherever they are in the world. So in the early 20th century, the Marxist theory of imperialism, developed by Lenin, by Nikolai Bukharin, by a certain extent Rosa Luxemburg, analysed the scramble for Africa and the hideous competition that led to the First World War. So could I have another slide, Claire? Sorry. So this is the background to the theory that Lenin and so on developed. The scramble for Africa, you can see all the different colonies coming out, the imperialist conquests coming out of Europe, and this was the background to the theory. And one of the questions raised in the First World War, a hideous slaughter in which millions of people died in absolutely appalling circumstances, was, will this be the war to end wars? That was the cry that people had. This war is so appalling. This will be the war to end wars. Bukharin, Lenin looked at the development of world capitalism and they said, no, this will never be an end to war because war is endemic in the system. They were very historically specific. They rejected the idea that imperialism has always existed as long as states have. You know, people talk about the Roman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the empires of South America and so on. They said, no, this is something specific to the last 150 years and the development of capitalism. They rejected the idea that imperialism is simply about big states dominating weaker states, although it can be that. They rejected the idea it is simply about rich, powerful countries establishing settler colonies and exterminating indigenous people, although it can include that. They said that's all part of the bloody history of class society, but imperialism is specific to a phase of capitalism. And the most influential Marxist theories, Bukharin and Lenin, said imperialism is not a policy. It's not something that governments can opt into or opt out of. It is a stage in the development of the capitalist system. And they identified a number of things that have to happen, developments in order for imperialism to rise. Firstly, imperialism emerges as a dominant feature of the world when three features develop. Firstly, the concentration and centralisation of capital. So through crises, through mergers, through banks taking over other banks, through big companies taking over smaller companies, bigger and bigger and bigger companies emerge, and they are very centralised. This leads to monopolies, with huge private companies dominating one sector of the economy, and banks and industries that we've heard this before, haven't we, that are too big to fail. You know, we all love the free market until a really big one goes down, and then they can't throw enough money at it. So those kind of monopolies. As Lenin said, if it was necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. Now, having done that, I'm not going to sit down, sorry, so I'm going to say some more. That's the briefest possible explanation, but I'm going to talk a little longer. As competition on the national level is reduced through mergers, through the development of huge, big corporations, internationally, competition intensifies. Lenin explained capitalism's transition to the monopoly stage of capitalism, and to finance capitalism, the important role of the banks is connected to the intensification of the struggle for the partitioning of the world. So there might be less banks in your country competing for the market, there might be less tyre companies or arms companies, but internationally the competition intensifies. And that point brings to the second point, the second condition that has to be fulfilled for imperialism to arise, the internationalisation of production and investment. On a world scale, capitals can no longer develop within their nation states. They have to go beyond to realise profits and so on. And at the end of the 19th century, there was a fusion between capital and the state. If the competition is global, companies need states. You might be a private corporation, but if you're having to compete with a company in Germany, in America, you need a state to protect your interests in the international arena. And of course, states need companies to help them develop and pay for weapons, to pay their taxes, and to keep the state going. So you get an interaction where big companies need a nation state to defend them, and nation states, of course, want big flourishing companies, so they will try to create the conditions for them to flourish. So we no longer have companies competing for global markets. With imperialism, we have military and territorial rivalries amongst nation states and amongst the companies based in their geographical area. It's important to note, I think, that saying that economic competition is vital to this does not mean that we are very crude about this. There are people who seek to explain every imperialist war or conquest by looking for oil, by looking for raw materials. I remember the late, great Tony Benn saying the Falkland Islands war was about the oil that was hidden in the waters around the Falkland Islands, trying to find a materialist, an economic explanation. Sometimes there are economic explanations, but often it is about geopolitical rivalry. It is about nations doing something to stop another nation doing it first. It's about that level of competition and the economic competition which underlies it. So rather than simply saying it's always about the wheat in Ukraine or the sugar in Cuba or the copper in Chile or whatever, we say there are political imperatives as well as economic ones. There are tensions, there are contradictions, and there's the sometimes, particularly with American imperialism, there are people asserting their right to intervene in the world. They're not necessarily after the oil, although sometimes they are. Sometimes they're about saying we've got the right to dominate this area of the world and our rivals haven't got the military power to do it. So The theory and practice. So those are the three conditions. We're talking about the uneven, the concentration, centralisation of capital, the internationalisation of production, and the third thing, which I was about to forget, is uneven development. That some imperialist powers, particularly Britain, developed first, and other imperialist powers are always going to play catch up, and that creates huge instability and rivalries in the system. So the First World War, in a sense, was a product of Germany attempting to carve out its own empire and rival Britain. So all those things have to be part of the equation as well. Often you get imperialist countries who get there first, and then others try to establish their own trading posts, their own military, naval advantage, and so stability is impossible. So we have the concentration and centralisation of capital, we have the internationalisation of production, and we have uneven development in which some countries are always trying to compete with the imperialist powers that were there first. In practice, capitalism, there are three phases, because although we say the centrality of our theory has remained static and stable and is vindicated by history, it doesn't mean it doesn't change at all. So we can talk about classical imperialism from the 1870s to 1945, the scramble for Africa, the British in India. And this is, I think, quite an interesting statistic. An Indian economist, Utsa Patnaik, said the wealth transfer from India to Britain between 1765 and 1938 was an estimated $45 trillion. So in that example, you can see it is a case of plundering a country for its resources. Other empires, it wasn't as obvious. They weren't necessarily providing loads of wealth for their imperialist power, but they were providing strategic importance, military importance, and so on. So in 1867, Africans controlled 90% of African territory. By 1900, Europeans controlled 90% of African territory. So you can see these can happen, these huge waves of imperialist expansion, which Lenin described like this. The characteristic feature of this period is the final partition of the globe, not in the sense of a new partition is impossible, but in the sense that the colonial policy the capitalist countries have completed is the seizure of unoccupied territories on our planet. For the first time, the world is shared out, so that in future only redivision is possible. So what they're fighting now is to redivide, to re-establish themselves. So then we get to the superpower imperialism of the Cold War. A politically bipolar world where you have blocs divided between Russia and America and people forced to choose between the two. War and instability is driven to the margins of the system. And I think particularly if you look at American history, I know lots of you will know this, no dictator was too brutal for America to support, to give aid to, and to back up if they thought that would give them an advantage over Russia. So Africa, yes, so the overthrowing of left-leaning governments. Could I have the next slide, Claire? Sorry. So what you find is a huge movement in Africa of post-colonial societies, free African societies with left-leaning. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, he was a beacon. You know, Martin Luther King went there, Maya Angelou went there. It was a beacon of hope, of inspiration that black people could finally be free and run their own societies. But as soon as this Patrice Lumumba was elected in 1960, the first president of the newly elected Congo, but as soon as he began to talk left, to talk about passing reforms that might matter to his people, the old colonial powers clamped down. He was executed by a firing squad overseen by Belgian officers. And Belgian history in the Congo is one of the most obscene examples of colonial brutality, which I don't have time to go into, and I'm sure people will know. But the Belgians, although this was a free country, were still there. Were still there saying they defended their ex-colonial people. And this man was shot by a firing squad, backed up by guess who? America. A similar thing with Latin America. Thank you, Claire. Salvador Allende, a left-wing president elected in Chile in 1970, dared to nationalise the copper industry. That's all he did. He nationalised the copper industry. He didn't nationalise the banks. He didn't kick out the Americans, but that was too much. So they cut off aid. He turns to Russia, and the bombardment and appalling military coup orchestrated by America in 1973, the 9/11 that we remember alongside the American one. Henry Kissinger, the war criminal, was quite open about what they said, about what was needed in Chile. He said, we need a military coup. And that's what they did. They organised it. And I could go through. I won't, A, because I don't have time, and B, because I'm sure you know a lot of these stories. Vietnam and Cambodia, between 1965 and 1957, they carpet bombed hugely densely populated areas. They dropped 500,000 tons of explosives on Cambodia, and all they achieved was the delay of the victory of the Khmer Rouge. They never stopped it happening. And of course, on the other side, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956 and of Afghanistan, although Afghanistan we will come back to because it's not easy, as we know, to invade and conquer and keep Afghanistan down. So eventually, Russia couldn't compete with America and collapsed. And so that was the end of this, that's Cambodia after America brought it peace and democracy at the hands of Henry Kissinger. So now we're at the stage of imperialism after the Cold War. America, the lone superpower, trying to entrench their global power under George Bush's New World Order. Some of you remember the Iraq War and so on. A whole series of bombings and invasions aimed at overcoming the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome, where they were so ignominiously defeated, and then they had to spend years and years trying to, the photos you can see, the connections between the people fighting back in the colony and the people fighting back in there. So trying to overcome the military Vietnam Syndrome, making them a bit afraid to intervene and trying to overcome that. But in some ways, military competition masking the fact that economically America wasn't the great superpower. It was being challenged by Germany in Europe, it's being challenged by Japan, and of course today it's being challenged very significantly by China. So today we have the rise of the sub-imperialisms, a fractured, complex, crisis-prone world where overlapping problems intensify each other, of war, of conquest, of climate change, and so on. And the US's war on terror, which was supposed to establish it as the great world power, the hegemonic power, has actually been a bit of a disaster. You think this is a country that spends huge amounts of arms, that has a bigger military budget than any other country in the world, and yet they have failed on a whole number of imperialist projects. They failed in Iraq, they failed in Afghanistan, and in the last couple of months they also failed in Yemen, despite bombing that country back almost to the Stone Age. So today we see the rise of China, the biggest manufacturing bloc economy outside of the US, and who has the geopolitical aim of pushing America out of Asia and threatening US domination in the Pacific. So The Economist said recently that Western resolve to make Putin pay for his crimes would be the most effective curb on Chinese ambitions. So you can see the people kind of developing these strategies, see the connections. They want to strengthen NATO in order to keep Putin under control, because that is another lesson to China not to mess about. And constantly with imperialism, you see how these things feed into each other. They're doing one thing to show somebody else that they can do it and they shouldn't be messed with. So Biden continued Trump's economic war on China, but said he would end the forever wars. And we saw what he meant in Afghanistan. What he meant was get all the American troops out and leave the Afghanis in the most appalling mess possible. But actually, that's not that easy. So very quietly, on May the 16th, they announced that 500 troops, American troops, were going back on the ground in Somalia. And anybody who knows anything about recent history or has even seen the film Black Hawk Down will know that Somalia was not a raging success for American intervention, and it's not going to be this time either. They can declare the end of forever wars, but they get sucked back into trying to create their sphere of influence, trying to stop, in this case, Islamic fundamentalist groups taking over. So they may want to pull out of the wars, but they sometimes get sucked back in. And so what we see in Ukraine in some ways is the proxy war, where the US is uniting the world behind its leadership. The Financial Times said, today, Eastern Europe is more militarised than at any time since the height of the Cold War. Once again, nuclear superpowers face across the wide expanse between the Baltic and the Black Sea. And we know our own government has just found money, hasn't it? Was it £2 billion they're now sending? So we see this incredible sort of almost replay of the Cold War with huge amounts of resources that are not there for everybody else, but are there when it comes to war and to imperialism. So just to draw that to a close, a number of times over the last few years, well, starting with Karl Kautsky in 1914, so it's a bit of a longer time ago, there have been very clever theorists on the left who've said, capitalism, it doesn't really need imperialism. It's a bit irrational, isn't it? Why would you, if you were the head of Tesco's, why would you want to give lots of money to go and fight a war in Ukraine? Why would you want to do these things? They've said, we're entering a phase of ultra-imperialism, was Karl Kautsky's words, although he was writing in 1914, which made it a slightly difficult theory to justify. But the idea that his idea was that the capitalist economy is threatened by disputes. It threatens the economy. And every far-sighted capitalist today must call on his fellows. Capitalists of all countries unite. And they didn't in 1914, and they really haven't done at any time since, because, of course, it's a utopian dream to think our rulers can ever unite with each other. They are locked into a world, whether they like it or not, of competition, which is driving what they do. We were told, of course, that the collapse of communism was the end of history. We were told that globalisation meant that military antagonisms were now a thing of the past. Absurd. Why would you have a war now when we have a global world? We don't need nationalism and national states anymore. But, of course, they come back, and they come back with a vengeance. We were told that imperialism has now been replaced by empire. Now we have the hegemony of America, the rule of law, democracy, things like that. So now, but every time one of these theories is put forward, a new wave of imperialist war breaks out. And we would be disarmed if we did not understand, and it's vital that we insist that imperialism is a stage in the development of capitalism, which inevitably leads to the obscenity of war and destruction. So, to conclude, the theory of imperialism is not a crude one. We do not say, where's the oil, where's the wheat, where's the sugar? We understand there is military competition, geopolitical competition that lies with and interweaves with economic competition. We know that there are political imperatives as well as economic ones. We also know that ideology and rhetoric can be very important. I'm sure many of you, like me, remember that we were going to war in Afghanistan to liberate women. And we had the B-52 bomber feminists like Hillary Clinton saying we're going to have, lipstick feminism in Afghanistan. That's quite hard for them to do now, isn't it? That's quite hard for America to pull people behind them on the basis that they're going to Go and ban abortion in every country around the world? This is a state which itself has been called to account for its systematically racist police force and state, the levels of incarceration, and so on. Anyway, don't get me started on America. So, resisting the rhetoric of humanitarianism, the idea of liberating women, human rights and democracy is very powerful, because when they do that, when they promote that rhetoric, it can disarm us. Very final point. The Marxist theory of imperialism is a method which enables us to look beyond the self-justification of ruling class people and imperialists, and to place conflicts in their global and economic context. In the context of global economic and political competition. It's not a substitute for analysing each situation carefully. It is a theoretical approach. Imperialism shapes our world. Military spending in America now tops $900 billion a year. That's money that could, you can imagine all the things we could be spending on. I'm not going to tell you. Every person in America spends $2,000, gives $2,000 to the military. In comparison, China spends $300 billion. So China spends a third still of what America does, although I'm sure that's going up. It spends more on its military than the next 7 countries. Over 130 million Americans were employed by the Department of Defense in 2020. In planetary terms, America is the most murderous state ever. That doesn't mean you uncritically support anybody who America has a go at, but we do have to understand where the main enemy in planetary terms is, and it's in America. So our strategy is to stand with all those who want to oppose war, but we understand that war is endemic to capitalism. And I'm going to quote Rosa Luxemburg writing in 1916. World peace cannot be secured by utopian and basically reactionary plans as international courts of arbitration composed of capitalist diplomats, diplomatic agreements concerning disarmament, European federations, it sounds so familiar, doesn't it? Middle European customs unions, imperialist militarism and war will not be abolished or damned as long as the rule of the capitalist class continues uncontested. But imperialism breeds resistance. The Americans lost in Vietnam, they lost in Afghanistan. I don't think they're going to win in Somalia, they lost in Yemen. So we need to support those who on the receiving end of imperialism, but we also need to fight for a different world. We always pose internationalism as one of the highest duties of socialists. We never wrap ourselves in the Union Jack. We will never concede that there is something great about being British because you happen to be born in this place and not another place. Internationalism, as Rosa said, was the highest duty of all revolutionary socialists. And I'm going to end with her because I need to finish. In 1916, again, she wrote, "The Labour movement has confronted a choice. Either support nationalism and national defence and war, or fight for internationalism. Proletarians of all countries unite. This fateful choice has determined the course of history at many decisive moments." And the theory of imperialism helps us to make sure that at those decisive moments, we are on the right side, the side of international solidarity, and not on the side of imperialism and war.
Just a question, which is, was the Vietnam War a proxy imperialist conflict? And just the reason I'm asking is because it's like, I struggle with the whole thing around Ukraine, because people are arguing Ukraine is proxy imperialist conflict, which I think is true, but it's also, there's a fight against an invasion and a national liberation struggle. And I really struggle with the balance of these two conflicting aspects of it. Because, I mean, with Vietnam, there was arms going into North Vietnam from the USSR. I mean, I've been there, I recommend it. If you go to Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City, there's the Imperial Palace, and there's this, and there's the tank that smashed down the gates of that in 1975. It's still there, and that was made in the USSR. It was supplied by the USSR. And also there was anti-aircraft missiles being supplied by the USSR. And I don't think anyone at the time was really saying, oh, no arms for North Vietnam because it's a proxy imperialist conflict. Everyone was around the world on the left was rightly saying we want to see, Western imperialism get smashed, which is what happened. So I do struggle a bit with this. So I just want to raise that. Was Vietnam a proxy imperialist conflict? If so, what does that mean for the whole question of arming or not arming the two sides? So yeah, that's my question.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So my name's Adea, and this is my first time going to an event like this. And my main aim is to look at the arguments as objectively as possible, so I can come to a conclusion. But the main question I have for Judy after hearing your talk, which I found was really illuminating and fascinating, is you said that war is endemic to capitalism, but if we look at human history, surely war is just endemic to human nature. So even in non-industrialised societies, war still takes place. So how would you answer that question? Thank you.
It's a great question.
Attempting to answer the question that was raised here, kind of talking about why is the Marxist theory of imperialism relevant and linked to the capitalist system? And I think what kind of Marx, imperialism looking at capitalism is the global nature of imperialism, because capitalism has stalked its way all over the globe, and the fact that it is never a settled deal who is the strongest and the weakest, that's why it's never kind of we don't talk about the big bad US or the big bad whoever, England, because capitalism is a dynamic system that's never stable. There are people who are on the US was hegemonic somewhat for the last couple of decades, but they're on the downturn now, and we're seeing that China's coming up, seeing opportunities, to push forward and stake their own imperialist interests in their region. And I think what is specific about that is because that constant division and redivision. There has been conflict in human history, but that competitive accumulation that is locks every ruling class into that constant constant, that they can't escape even if they wanted to. They're driven to continually divide and re-divide the world, because that is how the capitalist system works. And if we were to fight for a new society, one that wasn't based on competition, a socialist society, we could see the opportunities of not having to like fight our neighbours for access to raw materials, but thinking about how we can live in a cooperative society. So I don't think that war and conflict is endemic to human nature. I think it is endemic to the system that we live in, and it cannot be escaped while we still live in this system because of the way that it constantly is changing. And I think that means we need a particular type of politics. We can't settle for the Labour Party that wants to kind of wrap itself in the Union Jack and fight for even more military spending in the Ukraine. We need to look to kind of the traditions that Judy talked about. We need to look to revolutionary socialism, the kind of politics that we have in the SWP, of always being on the side of the anti-imperialists and never on the side of the imperialists.
Hans-Peter, supporter of the Bolshevik tendency. I think the first speaker raised a good question about the Vietnam War, because Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union, and that takes us to the crux of the question of what imperialism is, I think, because there were no wealth transfers from Vietnam to the Soviet Union. There were hardly any wealth transfers within the former Warsaw Pact states, but there are wealth transfers in the system designed by the IMF, for example, to bring down governments that are non-compliant with IMF conditions and enforce austerity and privatization of their national wealth. And it raises the question of Russia today, because the Russian economy isn't very strong. It's mostly based on carbon export, the export of energy. Russia has been selling energy to its near abroad actually at subsidized rates, so they're actually not making money beyond the world market price from it, but they're actually paying to export it, including to Ukraine actually until 2014 certainly. In 2014, the Brookings Institution published an article, Ukraine, a price that neither Russia nor the West can afford to win, because it suggested that if one of the forces took over Ukraine, you would just be subsidizing it. You're not making money from it. And I think the fundamental question is therefore, what is a justified defensive war versus a war, competition war over making extra profits?
Sum up, comment.
And I think the Russian war in Ukraine is tactically aggressive, but it's strategically defensive. NATO has been encircling Russia since 1990 in breaches of their promises, and anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Comrade in front of you. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Thomas, from the online editor of Socialist Work. I want to make 2 points. First of all, I think Judy's point about what is imperialism is incredibly important today. It's a global system where geopolitical and economic competition combines. And that means we don't take a crude view of how economic competition drives war within the system. Take the Iraq War, for example. The United States was waging a war for oil in one sense, but it wasn't because it wanted to simply transfer the oil wealth of Iraq back to itself. It has plenty of oil itself, took it from Venezuela and so on. It was because it wanted to control this vast deposit of oil in the world, so other states that were competing with it wouldn't gain control of this, in particular China, to sort of try and choke off Chinese economic growth, because it understood China would be its major imperialist competitor in the coming decade. And therefore, I don't think we can reduce imperialism to simple wealth transfers. By the way, there were wealth transfers within the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union asset strip, the East German economy right at the beginning. The second thing I want to say is about opposition to imperialism. The first way we have to do this is by saying the main enemy is at home. Now, when Lenin said this, there were people who turned around and said, well, how can the main enemy be at home? How can everybody lose? And he said, well, it's very simple. our side can win and their side can lose. We have to turn an imperialist war into a war against the imperialist system. So in Russia, the main enemy for Russian socialists is the Russian ruling class. In our country, it's against our ruling class, but not because we ignore the other imperialist powers. There is no such thing as defensive imperialist power. It's because that's the best way to fight back against the system as a whole. The second way to do this is through supporting national liberation struggles. And I think that's where the question about arms is important. Vietnam was not a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a war for national liberation, first against the French, then the Japanese, and including the British, and then the Americans. Now, national liberation movements have taken arms from other imperialist powers. In Vietnam, this happened from the Chinese and the Russians. In the Irish struggle for liberation, was talk of taking arms from the Germans. But these movements did not subordinate themselves politically to other imperialist powers. The Irish rebellion was not fighting to be part of the German Empire. The Vietnamese were not fighting to become part of China or the Soviet Union. If you look at what Zelensky is doing, the national liberation in Ukraine has become a plaything of the major imperialist powers, and Zelensky says his aim is to make Ukraine a big Israel. In other words, an armed outpost for US imperialism and a barrack society. And the United States understands this. It says Ukraine is of strategic importance so it can compete with Russia and compete with China. And therefore, pouring arms there is not simply supporting a national liberation movement, it is fueling a proxy war between two imperialist powers. And therefore, one has to demand Russian troops out, but also be very clear that NATO is not the solution and refuse to be cajoled into dropping our opposition to it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points about Vietnam, and hopefully it'll make a general point. As Tomas has just said, the Vietnam was a liberation struggle. And not only that, it was a liberation struggle that was directed against an imperialist power that was certainly obviously engaged in the Cold War with rivalry with its prime superpower foe, but they weren't confronting each other in Southeast Asia with the intention of trying to take each other's sphere of influence off each other. One of the great kind of features of the Cold War, really from the Yalta Conference in 1945, was the way in which the Cold War superpowers refrained from intervening in each other's domination within their own spheres of influence. If you do want a comparison from the Cold War or proxy war, then you have to look to Korea, where China and Russia tried to encourage North Korea to invade South Korea as a proxy against US influence and domination. That then spilled over into a confrontation between the superpowers, dragging in first the US and its allies, and then China into a confrontation in Korea. We said at the time, from the beginning, that that was a proxy war. In fact, the slogan, neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism, was Tony Cliff's concluding passage to his account of the Korean proxy war. That is different from Ukraine, where both camps are trying to seize influence, domination, control, economic and military, across the Eurasian fault line, from the Balkans to China. By the way, dragging in China as well. That's the difference. So the struggle in Ukraine, the resistance to the Russian invasion, has become subsumed into the imperialist proxy war. And that really is the difference.
Yeah, I was kind of interested. I know there's been a lot talking in war, but I'm going to pivot a little to another kind of war, and I think it's part of imperialism, and that's the war on drugs. You know, because the way I see it, yeah, the war on drugs is, a lot of it is about capital accumulation. Because if you look at the profits of the war on drugs, you know, 94% of them lie in Western banks. You know, I mean, it's okay, they occasionally they'll grab hold of a narco lord and say, look, we're fighting the war, you know, we grabbed El Chapo, he's, you know, we'll life him off, you know. But when it comes to, say, like laundering narco money, say like when HSBC gets caught, you know, with 7 trillion coming out of Mexico, and it don't take a PhD in economics to know who's got $7 trillion in Mexico, and they're not non-profits, you know, giving away money for building things for the poor, you know. And I think it's a way as well of kind of like militarizing societies, you know. You see constantly, you know, that the places that get highest police levels, you know, oh, we're fighting the war on drugs, and they generally it's like generally people are the poorest areas. Yeah, I mean, everybody uses drugs as much as everybody else. You look at the people who go to prison, it's also racism. You know, you look at the people who get sent to prison, you know, just as many white people use drugs as just as many black people. But who goes to prison? It's always the black people. They always get the highest prison sentences. You know, I wonder if you could talk a bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we talked about the purpose of imperialist war, and we talked about how it does have an economic purpose, but it also has a political, geopolitical, and military purposes. But I'm not sure about that, if I'm honest. I think that all roads do lead to capitalist growth. It all comes back, directly or indirectly, to an economic purpose. So we talk about the invasion of Ukraine. So the US isn't opposing Russia just for the fun of it. It's not opposing it because it's the enemy. I think it's much more likely that it's opposing it because it has an interest in controlling Russian resources, and it has an interest in exporting American goods to Russia to expand its markets. And I think that is the most important part of imperialism, of imperialist conflicts. It's not necessarily dragging resources back to feed the American and the Western metropolis. I think it's more about exporting Western-made goods into these areas. I think it's expanding Western markets. And there is evidence for this. If we look at India, the purpose of the British invasion of India wasn't just to harvest cotton, it wasn't just to steal cotton and grain from the Indians, it was to export British-made textiles over to India. And they did this, and they destroyed the Indian industry, and they set India back 200 years. But they did it so that the British textile makers would never run out of work. They did it so that British textile makers, the vanguard of the British Industrial Revolution, will be able to continue to expand. And I think that is the crux of imperialist war and imperialist conflict.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I found it really interesting as well. Thank you very much. I just wanted to make 2 points, and I think they might seem a bit contradictory, but I think they're not. The first is I think we can't talk about imperialism without also thinking about race as well. If we think about which countries colonize which countries and so on, I think conversations of imperialism should also include conversations on race and how it was also legitimized using science as well, which again links to, of course, economics as well, about eugenics and so on, and how colonialism was framed as a civilizing project and so on. So I think there is the economic side of things and the material impact of it and the extraction and so on. But also I think it's also a question of race and hierarchies of the world and who thinks who's superior to who and so on as well. But I think, having said that, I think the second point also is that I think we should also recognize that formerly colonized countries can also become colonial and imperial in their own right as well. This could include to other countries like big powers like China, Russia, India, and so on, but also to minorities within their own countries as well, especially kind of more nationalist, even liberation movements often turned on minorities within their own countries to kind of assert their own identities as well, and sometimes also to women and so on as well. So I think those 2 points basically.
I'm going to take 2 more contributions and then we'll come to bring Judy back. So Conrad, yeah.
Yeah, I think excellent point. I think actually a lot of racism does come out of the slave trade, but that wasn't what I was going to talk about. I think that's a crucial point about imperialism, about the origins of racism in certainly in Britain. I want to go back to Ukraine, because I think one of the things at the moment is we've grown up, most of us probably in this room, grown up in a post-Cold War world, where we're used to seeing imperialism as being about Iraq, about Afghanistan, about countries on the periphery. I think countries like Vietnam were more on the periphery. They weren't likely to lead directly to 2 nuclear armed blocks or 3 nuclear armed blocks actually going to war with each other. But when you look at what's going on now with Ukraine, what we're actually seeing, I think, is since 1990 we saw the Russian power base, the Russian imperialist bloc, withdrawing its borders towards Russia, and the West having a deliberate policy of growing to the east with NATO expansion. NATO should have been disbanded in 1945, should have been disbanded in 1990 after the end of the Cold War. It didn't. Instead, there was a Western expansionism into the east, into trying to get more into the Baltic states, taking over, into Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, countries that before were part of the Russian sphere of domination bloc. And I think what we're now seeing is a regrowth of Russia trying to redivide the world again, back in its own interest, and another imperialism redivide. One of the scariest things I've seen lately is when you look at Kaliningrad, where there was a treaty to allow Russian goods from Russia into what has been able to transport goods by land into an area. Now, by suddenly imposing sanctions back across Lithuania and Poland to stop Russian goods going from one part of Russia to another sovereign part of Russia, that actually is an extremely scary prospect when you think about what that would mean if you were in the Russian imperialist bloc. And I think what we're now seeing is this divide, I think, is actually really scary, and people are coming out in the West. What we are now facing is actually nuclear armed states potentially fighting back over a war within Europe. And I think when we're talking about national liberation, yes, national liberation matters, and I think you've come ready to answer it before about Vietnam. But what we now have to get our heads around is this isn't just a colonial war being fought. This is a war as a potential to escalate quite quickly and quite seriously into a war that we haven't seen since 1939 or 1914. And I think that's a completely different context for imperialism today than we've had over the last few years.
Thank you very much, Tommy.
Comrades, the economic is always relevant to understanding imperialism, but we can't reduce imperialism to a narrow idea of economics, and particularly one economic factor. So whenever the ruling class wants to do something, there will be elements of the ruling class who will want to make profits and be able to make profits out of it. And of course, if you're going to war, the arms companies will do it. But if you look at the S&P 500 in America, it's 20% down and it's continuing to fall at the moment. And why is that? It's because the world economy is moving towards a very severe economic crisis, born out of inflation. Where's the inflation coming from? Well, it's coming in part from the Ukraine war, a war that Biden has stepped up from the get-go when the invasion occurred. This is very important. Again, maybe they would like to, exploit Russia more than they've been doing, because they've had McDonald's there. They've withdrawn them. That's the effect of the sanctions on Russia. So it's much more complicated than that. And so you have to understand the geopolitical that's driving all of this. And of course, if we have nuclear war, it not just kills millions of people, it destroys an awful lot of productive capacity and profits. But that's the logic of the system. And the system at the moment is that the multinationals are prepared to go along with Biden. That's what they think is necessary for the American state on which they depend to survive. But we need to link the Ukraine war and imperialism more generally to the effects on us. It's not just that we're going to lose people in battle. We don't have any in Ukraine at the moment. But we are losing people through the appalling inflation and the economic consequences of the crisis that is growing. So we need to link the economic crisis and capitalism, which is affecting our people, to imperialism in order to help that fight back to destroy imperialism and the capitalist system as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll bring Judy back in for 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Thank you, comrades. So many interesting points were raised, and I'm not going to be able to answer them all. And the great cheaty thing about speaking this early on a Saturday morning is you've all got lots of other meetings you can go to get your questions and answered in more detail if I fail. So again, just to come back to the point the last speaker made, we cannot reduce imperialism to simply a quest for markets or simply about transferring wealth. It is a much broader and more difficult beast to get our heads around. If it was that simple, it would be much easier, but it isn't. I mean, the history, you can go through India and what the British did trying to sell Indian opium to China and the wars that were fought and so on. But I don't think Boris Johnson is spending $2 billion in Ukraine to make Ukraine safe for Tesco's, Sainsbury's. I mean, I don't think he's there to expand British companies. I think he's there to save his political skin, as Margaret Thatcher did in the Falklands. These are not primarily economic motivations, they are political motivations, and actually I think they're even more obscene because of it, the idea that politicians can lose lives because they want to win the next election and so on. And I think the wealth transfer question, nobody has invaded Afghanistan because it is so rich. Nobody invaded Somalia because it was so rich. These were countries that did have a civil society, that did have reasonable standards of living and so on. They've been destroyed by imperialism, but these are not places where there is gold or where there is, rich crops of any sort. Look at the Yemen was quite a rich country actually until it was invaded, but nobody went there for its mineral deposits. They went there to fight for geopolitical influence, to stop the rise of potential rivals and so on. So, of course, at the end of the day, what governments and ruling classes want is to secure the conditions for capital accumulation. But that doesn't happen easily and without contradiction and without disruption. So just a couple of points. The question of racism is really important as a justification for imperialism, and thank you for raising it. When I was preparing for this meeting, I was reading about the Bengal famines of the 1870s, which was appalling. But the worst one, and I didn't show photos because I thought it was exploitative and unfair, but the pictures of starving Bengal people, trains of grain went past the villagers on their way to the troops and on their way to Serbia and so on, because Churchill wanted to bribe those countries to join the war effort. In cabinet meetings, he said, we don't need to worry about the Indians because they breed like rabbits, because they need a bit of backbone, because they need to stand on their own 2 feet while grain was being exported back from there. So, of course, the question of racism, the dehumanisation of oppressed peoples is always a feature. In the 19th century, feminists in this country justified colonialism on the basis that we were going to liberate Indian women, save them from the practice of suti, and get people out from behind the veil and so on. It happens in every century. And of course, you're right about the rise of sub-imperialisms. But moving swiftly on, the question of Vietnam and the proxy war. You have to look at every situation. What is the predominant characteristics of those movements? I'm not going to talk for too long because people have already done that. Because people got weapons from somewhere doesn't mean that they have tied themselves to that society, to that country, to that project as their aspiration. Zelensky has. It wasn't true in Vietnam, it is true here. You have to look at the predominant features of every imperialism. During the Cold War, most countries fighting for any kind of national autonomy or liberation were forced to choose between America and Russia. Now that choice is gone, and the choice now is US dominance or Al-Qaeda or some regional territory. The choices, we have to find better choices for people to make. And on the question of drugs, I did want to make a point that imperialism doesn't benefit the people in the country, the imperialist country. If you look at America, again, the question of drugs is appalling. The question of drug addiction, of suicide rates, of homicides by weapons are appalling. If you walk through, Detroit, you're not going to walk through a society where you say these are people benefiting from the fruits of imperialism, from wealth transfer, and from opening up markets. People in imperialist countries are as oppressed in their own way as the people in imperial countries. And America today is an incarceral state. It is a state that has more prisoners than any other society on earth, and so on. And drugs certainly fits into that. So I just want to make two final points. The first is, for all their wealth and power, for all their dominance in the world, America loses. And I think that's something that should give us courage and confidence. They can lose in places like Vietnam simply because it's a war of attrition that they cannot win. They can lose in places like Vietnam because a movement of resistance in the imperialist, the country being colonised, joins up with a social movement inside the imperialist country. Actually, they can also lose because of revolutions. And I want to talk a little bit about the First World War, partly in response to this, but partly also in response to the question about war and human nature. Because the people who said the main enemy at home in 1916 in Germany, or actually in Britain, ended up in prison. You know, Rosa Luxemburg, got them on the T-shirt, Clara Zetkin, Alexandra Kollontai, all these people, Karl Liebknecht, were imprisoned for their resistance to the First World War. And they were incredibly depressed at the beginning of that war because people signed up to a nationalist war. They weren't driven at the point of a bayonet to sign up, they volunteered. And when Trotsky wrote about it, he said people's lives are so boring, they're so mundane, people feel so atomised and isolated that the prospect of being part of this glorious imperial adventure, signing up with your comrades, being a family, enticed young working class men to sign up to kill the Hun, to kill the enemy, to kill the barbaric Russian. 3 or 4 years later, the very same people are rising up to overthrow not only the war, but the capitalist system which bred that war. Explicitly, we are against the war, but we are against the system which breeds this war and all wars. And I read a description of Hungary, a May Day in 1918, and the woman journalist said, men who weeks and months ago were firing on each other walked arm in arm. And the point of this is that when people have a real prospect of change, then those ideas, that question of human nature, is it always violent? There's always been wars as long as there's been states, as long as there's been surpluses in society that people can fight over. It's not always been true, but anyway. So human nature is shaped by the society we live in, but we are not passive in it. We can shape that society back again. And I think when you look at, the reason I emphasise that capitalism isn't peaceful is because we're told that it is. Most of us, most of the time, won't be bombed at the moment. Things can change. But when you look at it as a global system, there is never a day where somebody isn't being bombed, driven out of their home. Now, I find the stuff about Ukraine incredibly moving, but I also find it really annoying and infuriating. That's the same in Yemen, but we don't see that on the screen. We don't see the world's. We say, oh, they're European, they look like us, they're wearing our trainers. As if it matters that people being bombed in Somalia or Yemen are somehow less important. This system pretends it's going to give us peace. Then they say, here's this psychopathic leader, came out of nowhere, the tyrant, wanting to spread, to give us these superficial justifications for what's going on in the world. And we have to insist this is a society which will not let us live in peace, which will not offer us security, not here, not anywhere, which will drive us to the brink, not only of imperialism, war, but of climate change and economic crisis. And we have to stand up and fight back against that because it's not inevitable. It's not true that human beings love making war on each other, are driven this way, and there is no chance. If you look at what happened in the First World War and the fantastic revolutions that ended that war, you can see that when you're faced with the choice, the slide's gone, that Rosa Luxemburg said, of socialism or barbarism, we have to choose socialism, but that means we have to organise for it now. And a woman at the rally said last night, she said, I want to change, one of the speakers, Tandrimi, she said, I want to change the world and I'm willing to play my part. And if you want to be as organised as they are and as international as they are and stand up for your brothers and sisters around the world against the capitalists who will divide us, exploit us and put a bayonet in our hands, then you need to join with us.